Okay, let's get it. Black girl magic dripping. Yeah, she's on a mission. Keeping our culture lifted. Now you can watch and listen to Tammi Mac. Tammi Mac. Oh, what show is that? It's the Tammi Mac Show on Fox Soul. Tammi Mac. Tammi Mac. Yeah. Ooh, that. Tammi Mac. Tammi Mac. Hey, so you know this. Tammi Mac. Hey, Tammi Mac.
Welcome to the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tammi Mac. Yeah, owe me back like you owe your tax. Owe me back like 40 acres to blacks, said Nas in his song You Owe Me. And then there's Spike Lee's 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks. And in the words of Sam Cooke, it's been a long time coming in the execution of repairing America's original sin of slavery. Since the protest of George Floyd and Americans literally seeing a black man die at the hands of the police in broad daylight, there has been reparation conversations in a real way. 11 mayors from Los Angeles to Asheville, North Carolina, have committed to form commissions that will develop pilot programs to pay reparations to small groups of black residents in their cities. Well, tonight, the business of being black on the Tammi Mac Late Show is reparations for African Americans in America. Please welcome the Brookings Institution, David M. Rubenstein Fellow and Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Rashawn Ray is with us. Hey, Dr. Ray.
Hey, thank you for having me. I look forward to this important conversation.
The Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program Senior Fellow and author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, Andre Perry's with us.
Hey, let's get it, Tim.
Let's get it, Andre. The National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants Board member and host of Politics in Black podcast, Chad Brown. Hey, Chad.
Hey, Tammi, good evening. Thank you again for having us back.
Thank you. And the co-chair of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, Los Angeles, and recently appointed commissioner to Mayor Garcetti's Los Angeles Reparations Committee, Friday Jones. Hand claps for that Black girl magic. Hey, Friday.
Hey, Tammi. Hey, Ms. Mac. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being on the show. I would get into it with you and ask you, are we going to get these reparations or what? But I'll hold off on that, okay? I will hold off and ask the traditional Tammi Mac Late Show question to all of you. Why should Black people care about reparations? Look, we got a whole bunch of millionaires. We've even got billionaires. We've got Black women like Friday Jones holding her own. And I shall not disclude myself. I'm a Black woman holding my own. I don't need nobody's help. And I'm sure you lovely men on the panel don't need help either. So why should Black people care about reparations?
Well, I'll start. We are certainly powerful, but we are not protected because we don't have the wealth, the protection of wealth. Black families have 10 times less the amount of wealth as white families. And we know that wealth predicts for everything from education, attainment, to health, to how often you interface with the police. Wealth predicts for so much of the quality of life measures that we see. So when you don't have wealth, you have poor outcomes. And we certainly know after this pandemic that Black and brown people who have low wealth, were dying at 2-3 times that of whites. And so if we really want to advance in this country, we really will need some type of stimulus package, some type of, call it reparations, call it stimulus. Even if we removed all the drags of racism in our policies, we're still going to have a wealth gap. And the way to correct for that is some type of reparations. So if we really do want the protection we deserve, we should get what we are owed, and that's reparations.
Chad?
Yeah, I think Andre nailed it. And, Black people should care because it is a debt that is owed to us. It represents our stolen inheritance. From 1865 forward, we've been plundered as a community, and reparations is the wealth that has been taken from us. So Black people should care about reparations for the same reasons that white households care about their inheritances. It's owed to us, and it brings us back into a competitive stance in this country. Right now, we are in steady decline And COVID has only escalated that. So this is the singular solution to bring us back into a station of being competitive and being a viable group in this country.
Dr. Ray.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, look, Black people should care because it's a debt owed. And as Nas said, I'd be Ivy League if America played fair. America has never played fair. And as much as we like to highlight Oprah or Jay-Z or some of these others, I always think about how many more Oprahs would we actually have if America played fair. So we know that 10-to-1 wealth gap where whites have 10 times as much wealth as Black people. The average Black person, and that is most Black people, are not doing well. Income is not wealth. It definitely is not the intergenerational transmission of wealth, the ability for us to send our kids to college, the ability for us to start up businesses, the ability for us to put money down on homes, particularly in this particular real estate climate. So as we think about the reason why Black people should care, as MLK said, we have come to DC, to the federal government, and we have a check that has been marked with insufficient funds. And those insufficient funds have been going on for centuries. And that is money that is not only owed us, but it is also something that we should do for our ancestors because it's due them. And therefore, it's due us regardless of whether or not we're doing well or not. This is about repaying a debt. And that debt is owed regardless if we're doing fine. But most of us are not doing fine, as Jay-Z has said.
Listen, I love how you say income is not wealth. I mean, that's just beautiful because I think a lot of times we do think income equals to wealth, and that is just not true. Friday, why should Black people care?
So I have a couple of answers, actually. This is the closest I feel like we as Black people have been in this nation. Callie House, immediately after slavery, tried to figure out a way to get a pension fund, a pension payable to freed people immediately after 1865 Civil War. She had about 30,000 members. This is in snail mail time. She had 30,000 members that had signed into her organization for the effort of petitioning the United States government for an enslaved pension. That was shut down by the United States government. My mother has essentially lived under apartheid in this country. My grandmother has lived under apartheid in this country. They are both alive. My great-grandmother died in 2012. This idea that we are so far removed from the vestiges of slavery in this country, it's literally one generation away. And to the extent that we have social media, we can engage with our leadership on Capitol Hill. We have these 10 mayors, and I hope that list of 10 mayors grows nationwide. This is the time where the momentum is here. This is a time when we're closest able to do it. This is a time where terrorism, in terms of white terrorism, even though it's at a high, we're at a place where you can't just kill somebody just because they're Black. You can't. The average citizen can't. We're not going to get into police, but this is a time where you can't do that. So I think the nation as a whole is prepared. And so we have to build on this momentum. It is time.
And Tammi, can I just briefly add on to the conversation? Because most of us on this panel, we talk about wealth and the economics associated with reparations, but we should also really have a conversation about power in this country. I mean, wealth is power, but it's also about being able to control our lives, being able to have autonomy, being able to have protection. And so when we're talking about reparations and wealth, it's really about a conversation about power. Because as we saw over this last election, certainly we can get things done in a temporary type things, but when you don't have power, people will change the laws.
Yes.
To ensure victory in case of electoral votes. And so reparations is also about us gaining power and momentum in this country, something that we have lacked. We've always had the skill. We've always had the intellect. We always had the will. What we have not had is the land, the control, the power that will really put us in a place where we're not put upon every time we take a step forward. And so for me, we'll talk a lot about economics, certainly during this hour, but this is also just about power in this country.
Yeah. And when I ask the question, why should Black people care? I think I flip it a little bit for myself to answer the question. I think America should care because it'll finally shut Black folk up. I'm like, if nothing else, don't you want to shut us up and be like, okay, here's your money, get it, okay. And I'm not being funny about that, but when you hear over and over again, oh my God, that was so long ago. Oh, how long are we going to talk about this? Well, my goodness, my ancestors didn't own no slaves. I don't own slaves. My mama don't own slaves. And it speaks to Friday when you talk about how close we are to the generations that were enslaved. But I just think if America wants us to shut up, then just do the right thing. And then, we're quiet about that. About that. Let me be specific. Yeah, about that. Because there is certainly more to be done. And there's certainly more conversation to be had about reparations. We're going to take a quick break and come right back on the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul. Back to the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul, where tonight the business of being Black is reparations for African Americans. Please welcome the Brookings Institution David M. Rubenstein Fellow and Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, Dr. Rashawn Ray, the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program Senior Fellow and author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, Andre Perry, the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants board member and host of Politics in Black podcast, Chad Brown, and the co-chair of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, Los Angeles, and recently appointed commissioner to Mayor Eric Garcetti's Los Angeles Reparations Committee, Friday Jones. Friday, I know you wanted to tag in on Andre, so let's go.
I did. So Andre spoke about power. And so today the headlines were, basically the GOP Senate smacked down the voters' right bill that the Democrats had put together. If you look at I think it was Mother Jones did an expose on dark money that had gone into the GOP campaign machine, where they targeted specifically local congressional leaders and said, we will vote you out of office. They raised $24 million in a matter of months if they did not vote against the voters' right bill. We need to be able to wield that kind of political power. We need for our politicians to come to us and ask for more than just our vote. The reason they ask primarily for just our vote is because they know that we are a wealthless group of people who are tied to the vestiges of poverty that are tied to slavery.
Oh, yeah. Our soulmates are chiming in here. So let's go to the soulmates and see what they are saying in our chat room here. Reparations doesn't even have to be in actual cash, but there are other forms such as land, free tier 1 education, housing, stocks, etc. At this point, the United States government is just stalling. The case for reparations has been made and the powers that be are just playing dumb. Is that what's happening, Chad? Are they playing dumb?
Well, just one point about cash. Without cash, it's not reparations. Obviously, reparations is more than cash, but without cash, it is not reparations. So
now that's a new one on me, because I always thought, look, you don't have to give us any money. Give us, waive our education, waive our taxes, give us our land. I thought that would be reparations. So why are you saying without cash, it doesn't equal to reparations? Please enlighten us.
So again, we're talking about wealth and the return of stolen wealth, a stolen wealth inheritance. So the end goal of reparations should be to close the racial wealth gap that you heard Rashawn speaking to earlier, in that white households own 10 times on average more than Black households. So we are talking about the restoration and the closure of that gap, and that must be done with cash. In fact, a majority of the reparations program would be in cash direct payments. Now, other programs are also viable, and we need to address other areas of society through policy, through transformative politics, but cash is essential.
Friday, and the United Nations set like a bar, right? They have minimal principles. They have 5 things under international humanitarian law. And any way you look at slavery in the United States, it falls under international humanitarian law, and you need 5 things. You need reparations, restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. So there is this whole idea that we can do it with everything but is a misnomer. I think we need to stick to international law. However America moves in making the repair of Black Americans, it has to include that component. You can't leave it out. Otherwise, it's not reparations.
And I also add that this only comes up when we speak about Black reparations. When we talk about Japanese American reparations, cash was included. When we speak about the victims of 9/11, cash was included. When we speak about Holocaust victims, even though the majority of those payments came from Germany, the United States also paid cash to those descendants. So it really is just an argument that's steeped in racism when I hear it.
You know, I will add there, I think there's one other important asset, if you will, that is very important. And it was the reason why 40 acres was principally the first reparations program, 40 acres and a mule, is land. Because even with cash, if you don't have the land to determine the means of production on it, you're going to be limited what you can use with cash. So I've always said that it is a suite of things, but certainly cash and land are, primary, they're essential. And then we can start talking about housing, educational benefits, business loans. And these are the things that Rashawn and I write about in various pieces. But certainly cash and land are essential if you're going to shift the wealth gap.
Dr. Rashawn, I want to talk to you about, I had this thought, what if reparations were given to Black people in 1865?
Look, if that had happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation for the most part. What people have to realize is that historically, Reconstruction failed. See, after the Civil War in 1865, after Juneteenth occurred, and of course, there's one important thing to note is that, of course, celebrating Juneteenth makes sense. It's the 11th federal holiday, but it is symbolic. It does not come along with any sort of material resources that address the bodily, financial, and emotional toll that slavery took. And what we have to note is that in 1865, there was something called the General Order Number 15 that came down from General Sherman. This was the 40 acres and a mule that we just heard about. That 40 acres and a mule was supposed to be given to Black people who had been enslaved. But instead, what quickly happened is that as the Union Army and as the United States tried to heal the nation, they bargained with the Confederacy, with Southern states, pulled out of the South, and instantly we had Jim Crow segregation, redlining, convict leasing, which was slavery by another name, in the state of Alabama. To tell people how long this continued, in the state of Alabama, convict leasing, which is where Black people got locked up for jaywalking or chewing gum in the street or looking at white people or trying to bargain for a barrel of hay,
or
put on the chain gang.
Arrested for popping a wheelie in the middle of the street. There, let's bring it to 2020,
Exactly. Very frivolous things that have no bearings that locks us up. 75% of the state of Alabama's income and financial resources came from convict leasing. So we wouldn't necessarily be having this conversation that happened. And then we got to think that not only that, slave owners got their land returned, and some of them, like in the DC area, even got reparations for lost wages, those lost wages being slaves. So see, part of when we talk about reparations and the way that we are describing what the United Nations has laid out, part of repairing, part of rehabilitation is a truth and reconciliation process to educate not only America, but also Black people about a history that has been robbed from us, not just our legacy coming from the continent of Africa, but even in the United States, not knowing the history of what has happened to our people. And that is the reason why when we talk about reparations, yes, cash payments, these wealth building opportunities, how we think about land is there. 25% of the United States is owned, 25% of land in the United States is owned by the federal government. It is federal land. We can lease that land. That land can be sold, because this is the thing. Cash is, of course, really important, but cash can start to lose its value, and we're starting to see that in the international market. We also need things that are going to accrue equity, right? And land is one of the only things. God isn't making any more of that unless the lands recede and we go to another planet. But we have to think about this in complex ways. And so what happened in 1865 is really important for people understanding that period from 1865 into the late 1970s was Reconstruction. There was more racial progress, more Black people owning businesses, more Black people owning homes, more Black people gaining political power. And it was taken from us the same way in this moment that we see voting rights being rolled back. We see states challenging the fact that kids are having discussions about racism in school. And I just want to quickly note this, that look, if Black kids are young enough to experience racism, white kids are young enough to learn about it. And I think this is the legacy and the sort of things that we have to think about reparations, truth, and reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely. Our soulmates are chiming in. Ronnie Lynn says, nah, reparations has to include cash. It's not reparations if no cash is involved. Ronnie also says, go Friday, yay, NAASD in the house. Deborah Will says, good evening to the Fox Soul family and Tammi Mack and guests. Good evening to you, Deborah. Thank you for always watching the Tammi Mack Late Show on Fox Soul. My life, Sisterella says, we had land because the freedmen were slave cropping farm owners. So we had land, she says. Queen Sugar is a depiction of the theft of many families' land. I don't think that America realizes just how much land has been taken away from Black people, land that Black people own. And we're not even talking about the Tulsa massacre. We're talking about, just small pieces of land, an acre here, 2 acres there, that Black folk owned and were bartering with Black people next door out of their own farms and yards and gardens. So why is it that those stories aren't being heard? Why is it that that is not a part of reparations in terms of a committee, Friday?
At the federal level, it absolutely 150% absolutely will be. I think to Andre's point, there has to be a portfolio of benefits, in my opinion. And I've always explained it like this. The federal government has so many departments. It has departments that have their own budgets, and the repair can be as expansive as our government has the ability to expand. And it's wider than the average person, I think, thinks. And to Rashawn's point, the Compromise of 1877, when the U.S. Marshals pulled out of the South, it is almost like the insurgency that happened on January 6th. And what is our federal government going to do now? And I don't want to say the GOP is the Confederates, but look at what was done and allowed for the Confederates to come back in and participate in this government and create Jim Crow. We have the GOP that won't even allow a commission to look at who participated, how they participated. The American people should be in the streets having an uproar right now in terms of what we are not doing, because we are creating an environment again that could set this country back. Reparations, in my opinion, is what we need to heal this country, to let white people get over their whiteness, to help Black people get over their hurt, historic past, so that we can move forward as a nation.
I'm going to the soulmates. Toya Foster says, I love this topic. I really enjoy what's being discussed, but this just seems like a lost cause to me. It just seems as though it will never happen. I think there are so many Black people. You have Black people who don't think reparations is necessary. You have Black people who think this will never happen in a million years. Why do we keep bringing it up? And then there are Black people like the 4 of you on this panel who are like, no, it's a possibility. Chad, why is it a possibility?
You also had Black people in the 1850s that said we'd never be free of bondage. So we have to understand that just because we don't see the likelihood in the present moment, that is not a reason not to advocate and fight for what is rightfully ours and what is due to us. And so we are doing work on the ground. Friday has just been appointed to the city's commission, as you said, on reparations. There are right now in California is a statewide task force that has been formed to study and develop proposals specifically from African Americans who descend out of US slavery. And we also have the HR 40 bill, which, while flawed, does still speak to the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and the continuing brutality and dispossession of Black Americans. So it is a very real, and I think on the last show, we also talked about how support for reparations has grown substantially in polling. So it is a very real prospect. Now, what we need, though, is we need the majority of Black Americans to understand what is owed, the scale on which you have been robbed, and now get active and vocal in your politics about the return of that wealth. So very real possibility. And I would tell that caller, that watcher, to get engaged. If in LA, reach out to NAASD LA. If anywhere in the country, reach out to the NAASD and get engaged and see what we're doing in the ground to make this a reality.
We're going to talk about that HR 40 bill when we return on the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul. Don't go anywhere, y'all. Stay right here. Stay right here. Welcome back to the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul. I was talking to you Black people. Y'all get books and think y'all uppity. Now y'all want reparations. What's up with that? All right, I'm Tammi Mac, and this show, The Business of Being Black, is about reparations for African Americans. So the HR 40 bill, let's talk about it. Proposed by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, introduced to House on January the 4th of this year. It establishes the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission will examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend solutions. Now, the commission will identify the role of the federal and state governments in supporting slavery. It will also identify forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants. And it will also support, or rather, it would also look into lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and the society. How do we feel about this bill, and how do we get people to support Representative Jackson Lee's bill? How do we make this happen?
Well, one of the soulmates asked a question or made a comment that she doesn't feel that this is going to happen, but it is happening, and that's what's important to note. In a recent piece that Rashawn Ray and I wrote, titled as "Juneteenth Becomes a Federal Holiday, the U.S. Needs a Cultural Reparations," and in it we cite a number of actions, one being this March, the city of Evanston approved the municipal reparations program, as they call it. You have Asheville, North Carolina, you have California, Virginia, Maryland, all offering some form of reparations. And you have HR 40. All of these things are showing that there's a culture developing, a reparative culture, that's stating in order for America to move forward, we have to do what's right. Now, at each of these local programs on its own will never capture the fullness of full reparations programs. But as we state all the time, reparations won't come from Washington, it will go to Washington. And so you're seeing HR 40, you're seeing, we showed the data, the Gallup poll that shows that reparation support went from 13% to more than double that over the last 20 years. You're seeing an overall change in culture. And HR 40, after 30 years of trying, it finally got out of committee. So for me, reparations is actually happening culturally. And the more it happens, the more likely you're going to see a congressional act of reparations, particularly for slavery. But it's already happening at a local level, not at the levels that we want to see, but it's developing the frameworks. We're learning from these, what's possible, and it's coming to Washington.
Yeah, I think people have to understand rolling a snowball uphill is much more difficult than pushing it down. So as we roll this ball up the hill, I think that it will gather some momentum and get larger and larger as we go. So Toya, I want to say to you, because you posed the question, is this in vain? Is the conversation in vain? So Toya, I want to tell you, first of all, the Tammi McLeod Show has no conversation that's in vain, sweetheart. I'll just put that out there right there. So you got to watch the Tammi McLeod Show every night, because we don't do vain conversations. But I think it's important that you know that our panelists, who are experts on reparations, say not only will it happen, but it is happening. And I think that's very important for people to know, that it is actually happening as we speak. There are motions being made for reparations for Black Americans. I want to go into here. Let's see. My Life says it's everything Republicans is inclusive of repair of all industries. Oh, I didn't quite understand that when it was connected to something else. Thank you, Chad. Tell the world, she says. Slaves were sold, traded, bartered with American cash. I guess that means so we need some American cash back. The German immigrants get cash that is documented by the IRS. I don't know the truth in that. Do any of our panelists know the truth in that?
Well, I think part of probably what is getting at is what people have to realize, and I want people to think about it like this. Imagine if at the federal level, after 156 years after the Holocaust, the only thing that Jews received was a federal holiday. Now, as Andre was saying, there's been tons of progress at the local, state, and federal level. And when it comes to Jewish Americans, I actually taught at the University of Mannheim in Germany. I studied what happened with the Holocaust, the way that Germany aimed to heal itself. And one of the things that happened is the Allied forces, particularly Great Britain, France, and the United States, played a role in ensuring that Jews who were impacted by the Holocaust, as well as others, received reparations. And not only have they continued to receive reparations, even some of their descendants are still receiving reparations. See, that's the thing that people have to realize about this here. There are already models set up that show us what is happening, and that is what is being followed. So yes, there's definitely some truth to that particular part of the process. And it's important also to note that when we start talking about reparations, that this model, these various models we have, are things that are currently being used, and policy is something that is being shifted at all levels to adjust for what is happening to Black Americans still today.
HR 40, one of our soulmates, Marcus, says HR 40 needs to be more specific on the recipient class. Right. Hashtag fix HR 40. Do any of you believe that?
Absolutely. So Fix HR 40 is a campaign that we've been running now for about 18 months. And we have identified serious flaws in HR 40. While we still have advocated for it, it needs to be overhauled in order to be effective. And the recipient class is one of those major areas that needs to be addressed. Right now, HR 40 is not specific in that it identifies African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the US, such as an AB 3121 in California does. So to Rashawn's point, what we're trying to do out here in California is model good legislation that then the federal government can use as a template to improve in HR 40. And we're doing so based on the work and research and recommendations of Dr. William A. Darity and Kirsten Mullen, authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And one of the things that we'd like to see from the federal government is consulting those experts for hearings, for additional edits to the bill, such as 1619. That is not an effective date. There was no America in 1619. And we all here agree that America is the culpable party who is responsible for the payment of reparations. The correct date would be 1776 or the founding of the Republic. So there are small nuances like that that need to be fixed in the current HR 40 bill for it not only to be effective, but for it also to reach the ultimate goal of closing the racial wealth gap.
And if I could tap in here, HR 40 also, it was modeled after the Japanese internment bill. The language in there is very similar. It's been modified for African Americans, but it literally came from that piece of legislation. Back then, and this was like back in the 80s, the internment bill called for compensation to the commissioners. None of the commissioners on the Japanese internment commission actually accepted compensation. 70% of the commissions formed at the federal level do not have compensation. So removing that clause would actually improve the chances, particularly with the GOP, which is where we would expect pushback from. The Los Angeles Commission, the commission that I'm on, is an unpaid commission. And I think that has value when you start trying to have this conversation. And to Chad's point, that 1776 formation with the United States, Rashawn said that the Allied forces came and supported Germany. Imagine the Allied forces that also had land here. France had land here, right? Even if we want to expand into the Caribbean, Portugal had land in the Caribbean. We had Mexico gets a little interesting. The Vatican gets to be interesting with some of the missionary work that was happening here in the United States. But I think starting at 1776 actually expands Black Americans' ability to then go to the Allied forces and say, hey, why don't we do the same thing that you did in Germany? Why don't you fix not just the United States of America and add to a claim that we as Black Americans may have for families that were in those foreign territories, but why don't you make this whole Western Hemisphere whole? And why don't you get involved in CARICOM? We could move just by changing the date. I think we really have a strong ability to change the conversation to go beyond just the United States government and to expand to the full effect of the transatlantic slave trade.
Our soulmate Noni says, educate us, Dr. Ray, keep speaking truth to power. And then Sister Rella says, bingo, Rashawn. And then Be the Power says, HR 40 is an extremely flawed proposal. And I have to say, to Be the Power, that's exactly why I have this panel on that I have right now, because they don't have any kind of motives. They speak the truth about everything. And they just sat here and admitted to you that there are some flaws in the HR 40 bill, but that doesn't mean it cannot be corrected, adjusted, and reparations cannot happen. So best believe we're going to bring it from both sides every time on the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul. We're going to break and we're coming right back. Welcome back to the Tammi Mac Late Show on Fox Soul, where tonight the business of being Black is reparations for African Americans in America. And I guess we have, let me ask my guest, we would have to say in America, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. A lot of people question who's Black. Who's Black? But how do you know who's Black? And I'm thinking, well, you know who's Black when the police pull you over. You know who's Black when you walk into a store and they're following behind you. You know who's Black when you appraise a house at a lower value. You know who's Black when you're not letting somebody into a higher institution of learning. So this whole, how do we know who's Black? Come on now.
But we do need to be clear that the British owe reparations for those who they colonized in the Caribbean. The French owe reparation to those they colonized around the world. There's different claims for different countries, but when you're talking about reparations in Americans, about the descendants of those, particularly for slavery, but when you're talking about reparations for housing discrimination, there are other folks in that were redlined and that can make a claim. So we just always got to be clear what the claim is. And there are different claims for different countries. And today we're talking about chiefly American slavery, also Jim Crow racism, and other forms of systemic racism.
So Republicans, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to clarify too, it is not about melanin content. What we are speaking to is a lineage of being persons descended out of an institution that was particular to the United States of America, and in the subsequent institution legalized apartheid, colloquially known as Jim Crow. So to those that are confused, think of it as you can't skip the slavery and Jim Crow and then expect to receive United States reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. I think that's the simplest way to put it.
What do you mean when you say you can't skip What do you mean?
We have to also realize that prior to 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965, the amount of Black and brown immigrants in this country was to the right of the decimal point. We were very largely African Americans who descended out of US slavery prior to 1965. And so that's the recipient class. That's the specific folks and their descendants that are eligible for a reparations program in the United States. Now, again, we are advocating for policies that would impact all Black Americans. But at the end of the day, when we speak specifically about reparations for the institutions of slavery and legalized Jim Crow and continuing brutality and atrocities here in this country, there is a specific class. And going back to HR 40, that specific class needs to be identified in the text of that legislation.
So Republican Mitch McConnell calls slavery America's original sin, but argued the country has since made racial progress and strides toward rectifying the past. Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya, including passing the civil rights legislation and electing Barack Obama. But journalist and author Ta-Nehisi Coates pointed out, well into this century, the United States was still paying out pensions to the heroes, or the heirs rather, of Civil War soldiers, despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Let's take a look.
One of the things I tried to make clear in my testimony is that we perceive the era of enslavement, the era of Jim Crow, and in fact, I would actually even add the era of mass incarceration as separate things that are somehow not tied to each other. The greatest damage that enslavement did, besides the economic damage, besides the normalization of torture, of rape, besides the normalization of treating people as though they are things, is the institution in the American mind that Black people are necessarily inferior. If I injure you, the injury persists even after I actually commit the act. If I stab you, you may suffer complications long after that initial actual stabbing. If I shoot you, you may suffer complications long after that initial shooting. That's the case with African Americans. There are people well within the living memory of this country that are still suffering from the after effects of that.
We talk about the after effects for anything, and I can't remember where I heard this, but I heard it today. Someone say, when you go to therapy, and anyone who's been to therapy, I myself have been to therapy for quite some time. And when you go into therapy, the first thing they ask you is about your past. What was it in your past that has affected who you are and how you think today? So if we can go into therapy in 2020, 2021, and have a therapist or a psychologist ask us what happened in our past that affects who we are today, then why is it that slavery is excluded from that same measure?
Brilliant question. And my answer to the Mitch McConnell piece, I don't know the mayor of Tulsa's name, but the mayor of Tulsa, like Mitch McConnell, comes from slave-owning families. And I think it's a very interesting national sort of psychological dynamic where you have in government, in positions of power, you have people whose wealth is tied to the institution of slavery, telling the descendants of the enslaved that they are not due reparations. Mm-hmm. So the creation of whiteness happened after Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. That was a time where the poor whites had gotten together with the enslaved people and had a rebellion against the wealthy oligarchs because they understood that their position and class at that time was very much tied together, more so than their whiteness and oligarchs. And so what Virginia did was say, well, the easiest way for us to remedy this is to bring race into it, and whiteness became a thing. So the psychological effects of whiteness have to be explored, in my opinion, as part of this reparations work. We as Black people need lineage therapy, and our lineage therapy will look very different than whiteness therapy, but they both need to happen. And they can't happen in a silo separate from each other. But we can't have people like Mitch McConnell, like the mayor of Tulsa, whose family was like one of the largest owning slave families in that region, being the dictators of what reparations look like for the injured, the multi-generational harm that's been wrested in our community. You can't drop a bomb on us and get to keep your stuff, and we have nothing.
Herb Saint, our soulmate, says this panel is serious about the discussion, and that's what this topic deserves. I concur, my brother, I concur. Then Marcus says the conversation isn't about Blackness, assuming he's talking to me because of my comments. It's about lineage. I understand that, okay? I understand that. I just get a little PO when people be like, but who's Black? I'm like, come on, people. Stop tripping. Stop treating us like we playing here. Lori Jenkins says it's like a class lawsuit. The class that was harmed were slaves. Therefore, their descendants are owed. I like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a
class
bingo
lawsuit. So we're
Shout out to my co-chair. That's the co-chair for the LA chapter. That's one of my co-chairs.
Shout out to Lori Jenkins.
Well, there it is. Let's take a quick break and come right back on the Tammi McLeod Show on Fox. So I want to ask our panel real quick, what is the argument against reparations? You've laid out quite a few pros to it and a lot of facts. What is the argument against reparations and why?
Go ahead.
No, I hear the argument, and it's a silly one, that I didn't own any slaves, therefore I shouldn't pay reparations. Well, you're not paying reparations, the federal government does. There are lots of highways that I've written on that I have not used, but the federal government paid for it. But I just want to say one thing, that there is a deep denial on the part of white people in a psychological sense, that because they want to sort of wash their hands of the past. We can't just wash our hands of this kind of injury. And it's the deep distress that they feel. And that comes from a lack of knowledge and education. And so the reason why white people should get the education around slavery, Jim Crow racism, historic discrimination, it will actually heal them so they can understand how ignorant they sound when they say silly, asinine things. Well, I don't own slaves. People just it sounds so ignorant because it is ignorant.
So let me stay on you, Andre. Know your price, valuing Black lives and property in America's Black cities. Where can we find that?
Oh, you can find it wherever fine books are sold. and also there's a lot of work on housing, and we actually are working with the Ashoka organization to give away $1 million of prize money to folks who are working on housing devaluation. So just Google it and get the book and you'll learn more. Excellent.
Chad, your podcast, Politics in Black.
Absolutely. So I co-host with Friday Jones, Politics in Black. We cover politics, news, and culture from a Black American perspective, broadcasting monthly on our YouTube channel, NAASDLA. Also, I tell your listeners, if you heard the conversation on HR 40, please visit our campaign, www.fixhr40.org. Also, you can connect with NAASD at NAASDLA.org.
Dr. Ray, what can we expect from you next? What are we doing here?
Well, look, people should go to brookings.edu, see the work that we've been doing over the past week. Andre and I put out 2 articles. One he mentioned that's at Brookings, another one that's at Reuters. And we're laying out and trying to debunk the claims that we can't actually give reparations. Again, federal land is the answer there. There's a precedent for these sort of things. And we're just doing this research to do a public education campaign to highlight to people what has happened to our people and the way that we can address those wrongs.
Excellent. Friday, I cannot leave this episode of the Tammi McLeod Show without reminding everyone that you were recently appointed commissioner to Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's Reparations Committee. So what do you hope to achieve in that position?
I have, that's a great question. Three primary things. My focus, obviously, being co-chair of National Assembly of American Slave Descendants, that will be my focus on that commission. There's also, I love that Garcetti is making sure that as the harms are identified, where the federal government was culpable in city action, I want to hold the federal government accountable to push that demand up. And then the last thing is I want to make sure that those 5 human rights issues that we previously discussed are addressed. NAASD-LA is getting to work. CJECofficial.com is staying on top of the AB 3121 State Commission. So please go to CJECofficial.org or NAASDLA.org to keep with us, because as California goes, so does the nation, and we are here for it.
Thank you so much, all of you on my panel. I appreciate it and look forward to seeing you yes again. That concludes the Tammi Mack Late Show on Fox Soul. Until tomorrow, everybody. Please remember, next week we're on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of next week. Until tomorrow, though, it's a blessing to be in your box. Bye, y'all.